when you think about corporate accountability, different things come to mind. So for some, it might be this really great civil society campaign. Others, it's worker reports, whistleblowing reports, or maybe new legislation that got put into place, a court case, you name it. And all of these different pieces are wins on their own, bringing us closer to the goal of holding companies accountable for their impacts on the world. But really, when we think about these things, often just a few names of these big names come to mind. It's the companies we're all way too familiar with. And so what about these guys? What about the ones that actually we are not in the public eye as much? There are just as much companies that influence our lives, influence our environment, have impacts there. And so shouldn't they be held accountable as well? And really what we are thinking about is, of course, these big names have the biggest impact. And so it makes a lot of sense that we focus on these companies when we in our work. But really, to get to the systemic change that we want to see, where companies actually have a positive contribution to the people and the planet, really, we need to start thinking about scaling that accountability, really starting to hold the millions of companies that are out there accountable, not just the top 10, 100, or maybe even 1,000 companies accountable. And so what we really need is to start to look at monitoring and understanding company impacts on an industry and kind of value chains level, and really working with that individual corporate accountability to turn companies into positive agents of change. And to start to do this kind of scaling, the first step really is collaboration. So making sure that our efforts are complementary and that the work that we're doing can be shared with each other, is accessible, and really is something that others can build upon. But beyond that, really, it's automation technologies that can take things to the next level, can really bring that scale that we're looking for, and really move us from just monitoring a couple thousand companies to millions of companies and really understanding their impacts. So that is really where we see the transformation coming from when it comes to corporate accountability. But as beautiful and as promising as that sounds, what does that automation really look like? Now, before the speakers really unpack this and bring it to life with examples and experiences in their work, I would really briefly like to take a brief sidestep and talk through some of the key concepts and phrases that you hear getting thrown around in the space, but often are a bit unveiled in magic. And so just to briefly go through some of those. So the first really is automation. What that refers to is really that it's a technology that reduces human intervention in a process. Similar to how we think about automation when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, for instance. But in this case, it's about instilling or actually coding this kind of predetermined decision patterns into computers, or actually sub-processes like relationships and related actions. Now, when this decision-making is taught to computers, we actually do that in the form of algorithms, which is in essence really a mathematical equation. You can think about it like, for instance, a question, for example, is the phrase modern slavery present in this text? Yes, no, or inconclusive. And that's really the kinds of questions that an algorithm goes through. And so we talk about artificial intelligence as a broader concept when you get a number of these algorithms working together, and they are actually able to do things that we usually associate with human intelligence, like visual recognition or speech recognition or decision making, things like that. Now, finally, when these algorithms are able to improve automatically, that is really through, for instance, working with a lot of the different data sets they have, and that experience of analyzing all that data. If they can use that to improve their own logic, really, that's when we talk about machine learning. And so machine learning sits within artificial intelligence. So that's just a quick crash course in some of these phrases. So then what is this session really about? Now, we're going to try and unpack for you the promise that AI and machine learning holds, but also at the same time, really hope to be diving into the disenchanting reality of how tough it can be to work with these tools, how resource intensive it can be, what kinds of challenges you might run into. And it's something that for civil society that is generally notoriously under-resourced, can be a tough nut to crack. And we're only seeing a few civil society organizations starting to work with these types of technologies now. And so we wanted to take a moment to share the learnings and share the experiences to make sure that we can also, not repeat some of the things that might be going wrong or some of the misunderstandings that you might get at a start when you start working with these types of technologies. So we hope that it will be an encouraging reality check and that you'll find that there's absolutely no need to be intimidated, and yet this working with these tools does not come without its own challenges. So before I then go into the speakers, I just wanted to say quickly, if you have questions, there will be about 15 to 20 minutes toward the end of the session where it's an open discussion and you can ask your questions yourself. You're also very welcome to put them in the chat in the meantime. When you do, please state your name, your affiliation, and whether your question is directed at a specific speaker, so that we can kind of make sure that we can tackle as many of the questions that might come up. So then our first speaker is Catherine Bryant. She's the lead of European engagement at Walk Free and co-author of the Global Slavery Index. Catherine oversees Walk Free's research program focused on what works to combat modern slavery, including the government response component of the GSI and the promising practice database. She also works on the assessment of statements produced by business under the UK Modern Slavery Act, which I've had the pleasure of working with her on. And she has worked in counter-trafficking and anti-slavery programming and research for the past 10 years. Catherine, please, over to you.
Thanks so much, Laureen, and yeah, good afternoon or good morning to everybody who's joining us on the call. For those of you who aren't familiar, Walk Free is an anti-slavery organisation that's based in Western Australia, and we use evidence to try and hold governments and businesses to account. And as Laureen mentioned, we're best known for the Global Slavery Index, but actually the case study I'm going to talk to you today about is the assessment of Modern Slavery Act statements. It's a project that we've worked with WikiRate since about 2016 called Beyond Compliance. And what we've been trying to do over the last couple of years is actually automate this assessment. So I'm just going to walk you through what the background to that project and some of the challenges that we've experienced in going through that. I'll also at the end give you some of the hope of some of the next steps for this project going forward. So for those of you who aren't familiar, under the UK Modern Slavery Act that was put in place in 2015, Section 54 requires companies that have a turnover of over £36 million per annum to release an annual statement on what they are or are not doing to tackle modern slavery within their direct operations and also within their supply chains. In 2018, Australia actually put in place similar legislation. Their threshold is slightly higher at 100 million Aussie dollars, that's about 50 million pounds per annum. But what that translates into is that we have an awful lot of companies around the world releasing annual statements about what they're doing to respond to modern slavery. And for us, it's really important to actually get into the detail of what's in those statements. So that was the kind of the ethos, the starting point for our project. And to give you some sense of some of the numbers, there are some, I think, 16 to 17,000 statements produced per annum just under the UK legislation. Under the Aussie legislation, it's looking like another 3,000 companies. So 20,000 companies or 20,000 statements per year that we want to be able to look at. At the moment, or over the last few years, we started doing this by working very closely in partnership with WikiRate and with universities around the world, getting them to assess the statements. One student looks at one statement, does a peer assessment, and then we go through a whole load of QA to make sure that that data is as accurate as possible before we put out our reports. So needless to say, there is an awful lot of resources, a lot of time and money that's spent on doing these assessments. And what we were looking for was some way to actually speed up or automate this process. So over the last 18 months, 2 years, we've been really, really lucky to work with the Future Society to try and test to see whether we can actually automate this. What I'm going to do now is just go through some of the difficulties, some of the challenges that we encountered in doing that assessment and that project with the Future Society. These are organised around both extracting the data and then also analysing the data. I will pop in the chat during the Q&A a link to a paper which goes through this in a little more detail as well, but I'll do that after I finish speaking. So to get started, we have to extract the data and get it into a format where it's structured, where we can actually then use the algorithm to actually read through some of this information. And before we get started with looking at these statements, we have to be able to access them and identify which companies are actually reported. This is a problem for both humans and machines alike. There is no list out there that exists of which companies should be reporting, so it's very difficult for us to identify who actually is subject to these requirements. That means when we first started doing this project, we'd have to scrape websites to try and find that information and then manually check whether or not they meet the threshold. There's been some great developments in the UK and Australia going in the last few years. They have central registries that house these statements that will make it a little bit easier for us to be able to identify those. But in the absence of that, or people aren't submitting to those registries, we're having to scrape the internet, scrape websites to find the statements. Issues are associated with that is that the statement can be missing, web pages change all the time, URLs change all the time, links can be unclear, or we can just have simple kind of server connection errors. So that's the first kind of hurdle we have to get up of actually getting the statements pulled together. When we have the statements, we then have to be able to read and pull out the information from those statements. And that's where we hit a little hurdle around the format of the reporting. There's very few digital formats within the Modern Slavery Act statements, and they're often PDFs, and PDFs can be scanned, so they're just images. They are formatted, and data can be embedded in graphs and images. And I should just note, like, the legislation, when it was first put in place for the UK Modern and Slavery Act and the Australian Modern Slavery Act, was set up so that humans can read these. They can be seen as a bit of CSR, like it's about showing what you're doing to respond to modern slavery. So they were never really intended to be read at scale. But ultimately, if this is going to be an effective piece of legislation, we should be able to read these at scale. So they often have very beautiful images, lots of infographics, which are very, very difficult to extract the text from and to actually read meaning into. And one of the key recommendations we make from our Digital Insights report is the need for clear, consistent structure, not split into several columns, fewer infographics, again, making it clearer for the machine to actually read these. That's on the extracting the data. The second piece is on around analysing the data. So now you have your data all in a beautiful structured format, and then we can start to assess these. Now we have 18 metrics that we use to read and assess the statements against. Some of these are binary and some of these are multi-class, so you have multiple options within these different metrics. Binary metrics can be a little bit easier, although I will caveat that they're saying that one of our metrics is whether or not a statement has been signed. If that signature is an image, it's very hard for us to actually read and see that that signature has been actually achieved or not. And then when we get onto multi-class, you effectively need a separate algorithm for every single subcategory of each metric. So rather than thinking you're going to make 18 algorithms, you might end up making 50 odd because of the subcategories that sit within those metrics. We also, because these statements are often written by corporate lawyers, they're very legalese. It's very difficult for a human to understand sometimes the language that goes into these, let alone trying to explain that to a machine. And then also there's some of the subtleties that we have around language. So for example, these statements might say things will be developed in the future. And so you may have a whistleblower mechanism maybe coming out soon or something like that. And it's about reading the context around that particular phrase or word to read in whether that it does or doesn't exist at this current point in time. I'd also say one of the things we're learning is that your data needs to be cleaner than clean. So making sure that your data is 100% accurate, because otherwise you will be training an algorithm that is then based on inherent biases within this data. And we obviously QA our work within an inch of its life before we release reports, but it's doing that for all of your data set. And that leads me on to my next point, that this actually needs to be done at scale. It's not enough to have one or two examples of a particular subclass or a subcategory. You need multiple instances of these in order to be able to train an algorithm at scale. Otherwise, there's just not enough data for it to be used. And then the final point around challenges is that for us, this is never going to replace human verification for this project. There is always going to need to be a process by which humans are involved in reading this. But what we're hoping with this is that it will speed up and take some of those resources away from actually doing all the research up front to actually doing a lot of the verification piece. I have 30 seconds, so just my final point is to go on to the future. We're really pleased. We're working with the Future Society at the moment and with an organisation called Miller based in Canada, who is doing an evaluation of this project to pull out some of these lessons learned and to try and work out the way forward for this particular piece of work. And the key thing for me is that automation is possible, and it's also somewhat inevitable. It's already used in lots of financial annual reporting, for example, across the EU, where companies actually have to disclose this information in machine readable formats. And the benefits to this are obvious: scale, accessibility, comparison, showing change over time. So we're still focusing on this as a solution for reading the assessments under the state and under the UK Modern Slavery Act. One of the final recommendations that we make in our paper, which I'll put in the chat in a second, is that these documents have to be made machine readable. And when we said this to the Australian government, they kind of laughed at us a little bit, thinking that this was crazy that you would try and make these statements machine readable. But ultimately, if we want this legislation to be effective, it has to be put in a format where actually computers can read this information in order to make them as transparent as possible. And sorry, I went over a little bit, but I will stop there.
No worries, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Catherine. And yeah, just to give you also a sense of why we're talking about, this scale. Just for the UK Act, we have 16,000 statements, an estimate of 16,000 statements coming out each year, and that's just the UK. So now you have also Australia, other countries are thinking about this kind of legislation as well. So yeah, we can work with a couple thousand volunteers and students and really bring a community together to help us. But ultimately, we're never going to be able to review that many statements every single year. So that's where the automation is just a crucial piece. Just to kind of recap a few things that we've heard there, we heard access to the data is important. We heard about language and context, having to consider that. When you think about just the questions that you want to assess or analyze, sometimes it seems like one question, but for an algorithm, that might be lots of different things, so lots of different algorithms, and also the large data sets that you need. So for instance, just to give an example that I remember from the projects, that very few of these statements actually talk about cases of forced labor that were found. If we don't have examples of that, we can't train an algorithm how to identify that in the text. So yeah, you also need to have the presence of that data. I will then now move on to our next speaker. Next up is MIT professor Alex Pentland, who is the founder and director of MIT Connection Science and co-creator of MIT Media Lab. He serves on advisory boards for the UN SDGs, the OECD, and the World Leadership Alliance with former prime ministers and presidents. He was a key in the development of the GDPR and national accountability with the SDGs. Great to have you with us today, Alex, and over to you. Oh, I see that you are, there we go.
Have me unmuted. Okay, great. I'm not quite sure what people are interested in here, but I thought I would just mention a couple things. One is that the core of any of these things at some level is data literacy. Literacy within your organization to be able to understand what does data mean, what is machine learning. It's actually not very complicated in the sort of simple forms. Often it's called business intelligence. It's an Excel spreadsheet where you look at trend analysis. That's a simple sort of machine learning and a simple sort of AI. Another type that's very common is if-then-else statements. People design business processes using if-then-else statements, and that's called expert systems in AI land. So you're actually familiar with this, and it's not beyond reach at all to get people on board with this, even if they believe that they're not technical or AI or something like that. We ran a course with the government of Canada to train people like plumbers and construction guys and stuff like that, people who ran those businesses, but people without degrees. And something like 15% of them by the end of the course were actually starting new data-driven enterprises to help manage their data better, their business better. And almost all of them were with Excel spreadsheets. But it just hadn't occurred to them that they had this resource from the sales data that they have from other sorts of suppliers, give them things. There's all sorts of things that most little businesses have. And remember that most little businesses are the place where almost half of all employees work. So it's important to reach the little businesses. But it's also really important to do this with, I will call it ethical concerns, but another way to sort of put it is, you want to make sure that you're not doing something that's going to increase the risk to your business or to your customers, because that way lies all sorts of bad things. Even if you're not particularly interested or don't think that you're doing something that is touches on ethical, there is a set of mental exercises you want to do, and actually physical exercises before you launch on any new thing. And here I'm speaking for a group that I co-chair with the IEEE. So the IEEE is the world's largest professional organization, and it's all those guys that do data and AI, right? All those men and women all around the world that write software and run computers. And the thing I co-chair is a standards body. And I'll give you sort of the gist of it. There's three things you really have to do when you're contemplating or launching an AI project or a data project. One is you have to go and write down who are all the stakeholders. So that doesn't mean the people in your company. It means what types of customers do you have? What sorts of other people would be affected by what you're doing? And you want to be sure to break those stakeholders down, particularly into sensitive groups. So age, gender, race, if that's something that you need to deal with, probably you do, et cetera, et cetera. And you need to write down, here's the different types of people that we're going to be affecting, and here's the outcome that we expect for those people. The outcome might be nothing, right? We're just not going to change the world for those sorts of people. But the reason to do this from a purely business point of view is risk mitigation. You don't want to have a lawsuit or be on the front page of the New York Times as the person who discriminated against X, whatever X is. You have to write down all the X's, what you think you're going to do to them, your goals. And then you need to write down a second list, which is what happens when you miss those goals? What happens when you launch something, you did your best to determine that it was fair, and it turns out that it's not? How are you going to go back and fix it? Who's going to do that? Which people on your team? How are you going to pay for that? How are you going to make, so you need to be watching the business and have a plan B already there for all the ways you can anticipate that it goes wrong. And you do this, this is not like a crazy thing. You do this whenever you launch any new product or new service. You say, is it going to make money? Is it going to pay the taxes? You know, am I going to get in trouble because it's illegal somehow? You think about all that stuff. Well, you have to think about that with AI too. But the part that I think most people miss is this, okay, what is it going to do? What happens if it goes wrong? That's great. But how are you going to audit it? How are you going to know when it went wrong? Are you going to know it went wrong when that lawsuit comes over through the mail? No, what you need to do is you need to have a process as part of your new system that says, here's the data I'm using, here's the decision I made in each case. So it's just like you do with your financial books, you know? Here's the thing I sold, here's how much money I made, blah, 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 whatever. That type of keeping your books. But you need to keep the books about what your AI, what your new system is doing. And that does a couple things. One is it tells you when you're going wrong, but it also means that if somebody accuses you of doing something wrong, you have the books to show that you're on it and you're paying attention and you're not wrong. And so it has that element of being businesslike about it, being serious, where you say, here's the things that can happen, here's the sort of re-engineering I need to do, and this is how I'm going to keep track of it, both for myself and everybody else. And I think the reason to sort of go back to basics like that and emphasize that is people tend to think of this stuff as a little bit of fairy dust. You know, you sprinkle it on things and it happens, right? But it sometimes doesn't go the way you expect, right? And the last thing you want is for it to hurt somebody or for you to be at risk of what you've done. And so a little bit of normal sort of keeping track of things and thinking through it beforehand is in order here. It doesn't have to be particularly burdensome. You do this with many other things already. It's just part of that, you know, thinking about it beforehand, thinking about what happens when it goes wrong, and keeping books. It's not expensive either. So that was my little piece. Hope that was useful to someone.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alex. And yeah, just to say, it's so great to hear. Yeah, it's when you are doing something new and you're really pushing the boundaries of what is possible and the systems, or if you're creating a new system, how can you integrate into that system that you keep yourself in check, that you are ready for things to not necessarily work out the way that you had expected them to, and to keep an eye on yourself as well, and to think through, you know, how will it affect all these different stakeholders? So yeah, thanks so much for that contribution. Then shifting our focus a little bit more to the supply chain and accountability in supply chains, we come to our next speaker, Natalie Gaion, Executive Director of the Open Apparel Registry, a free and open source registry and an interactive map of global apparel facilities, championing access to open data and transparent practices. Natalie has worked for a decade to launch innovative solutions to complex problems in the apparel sector. Over to you, Natalie.
Thanks, Laureen. Hi, everyone. Natalie Grillen. As Laureen shared, I'm the Executive Director of Open Apparel Registry. And as I start my comments, since we do have a small group with us listening in, I'd love to know who you are. I can see your name, but if you could just share what stakeholder group you're from or what organization, I think it will help in terms of directing my comments, because it's not often you get to, well, sometimes you're lucky to speak to a small group and you can sort of exchange in a great way. So if you have a chance to pop that into the chat, that would be great. So I'm going to start my comments with, sort of the root of the problem. I think we're all familiar with this image. It's one of the worst industrial disasters ever to occur, the Rana Plaza factory collapse. And this is where systems failed to protect 1,132 people who died, and then more than 2,500 who were injured in the collapse. And to the points that Lauren made about accountability earlier, and that Sandy just made about thinking through the risks that your operations can have. Many brands who were sourcing from this facility claim that they didn't know their products were being made there. And it's taken years to get compensation to the victims. And some companies have never paid. But it should have never happened in the first place. There are multiple root causes to this disaster, but I want to address one, and the solution that we developed using data and AI to tackle it. And that's the lack of transparency and data from apparel supply chains, which meant that these problems that were at the root of the collapse went ignored and unaddressed. So fashion supply chains are incredibly complex and they're frequently murky, and there's a variety of reasons. I think everyone in the room kind of knows what they are, but super quickly, creating an item of clothing isn't simple. Process of creating one ordinary t-shirt can take multiple facilities in multiple countries. And that's just one product in the inventory of brands and retailers that are churning out thousands of different products around the world on a weekly basis. Second, the industry is notorious for subcontracting. Very few companies control their means of production, and to meet fast deadlines, a trends-based system, companies will take a contract and then subcontract it to meet the cost and to meet the time. Third, cost of product is driven lower and lower. We all know this. You used to have to spend a lot of money in the 50s and 60s, right? You had a small wardrobe. Now people have hundreds of items of clothing. So the cost of production has driven lower and lower, meaning the production costs must be low. And then we're always chasing worse conditions and new suppliers who can offer a lower price. And this creates a dynamic shifting set of conditions alongside the seasonality and trend-based nature of fashion I mentioned. So consequently, the complex dynamic and brokered nature of apparel supply chains create opaque, conflicting, and erroneous data about where clothes are made. So how can better and open data help was the question. What if we could clean up that data, simplify access, make it accessible to all stakeholders, as Alex just mentioned, right? Who are the stakeholders that are implicated or impacted by this data? What would one centralized database mapping production to facilitate collaboration, prevent tragedies like Rana Plaza from happening, inform decision-making, and improve conditions in facilities worldwide? So let's take a look at this data quickly. You can see here some interesting data, right? Everybody, I hope, can see my screen well enough. Line 3 here is really illustrative. The country is Italy. The address is very clearly in China. This is data that's been entered into our system. You'll see this all over, right? More examples where Chinese data has been entered and assigned to another country. So really at the core, there's a lot of supply chain data that's really bad. It's just really bad. And why is that? It's dependent on low tech contributors, number one. 2, there's no industry-wide standards around name and address. It depends on the country. I've seen data that says 5 kilometers from the hospital, take a left as an address. Data is often extracted from PDF, which Catherine mentioned earlier. There's transliteration inconsistencies, translating from one language to another, non-structured addresses, and then international character sets where Turkish, Russian, Chinese, Vietnamese, Cambodian, right? These are different alphabets. So the OAR said, okay, what if we could solve this problem with AI and machine learning? So we are a neutral nonprofit that runs an open source tool with a machine learning algorithm at its core that maps garment facilities worldwide and assigns a unique ID number to each. Because of time, I'm not going to show the video, but I'll share the link in the chat afterwards. But essentially what we do is we process names and addresses through an algorithm and match and collate those names and addresses and create one common registry of facility names and addresses and an industry standard facility ID. It's a completely open database and free to access for anyone in the industry, civil society, brands and retailers, facilities themselves. Anyone can contribute data and anyone can access it. And what that does is it eliminates issues with matching across multiple inconsistent databases. And it enables in-facility collaboration between organizations. And super quickly, I'll just show you that the unique ID is this standard ID that actually gives you information about each of these facilities, a country ID, an origin of when the facility entered the database, a general ID that's just unique, and then a check ID to make sure that the ID is never replicated. We're not trying to replace any existing ID schemes. There's plenty that are used for business intelligence. We just serve as a clearinghouse of data alongside all of these other databases that exist that can serve to facilitate interoperability across these systems because anyone can access it. So quickly, what's the AI behind what we do? Imagine you have 50,000 facilities in your database and you upload 5,000. That's 250 million comparisons that would need to happen to process. you divide those comparisons per second, right? A 10,000 comparison per second, 3,600 seconds per hour. That's 7 hours to process a list of 5,000 facilities uploaded to our database. So we need a shortcut. And what we use is the dedupe open source Python library. In brief, what it essentially does is learns on an ongoing basis. It takes this fuzzy matching process and dedupes records and entity resolution. So we can take lots and lots of comparisons and actually process just very few and still have confidence in the results. So what that means is that we train a new model and we can process thousands of matches in less than 4 minutes. So if you upload a facility set to OAR, it can process your matches in, an hour or less, depending on how many you upload. So what are the benefits here? Look, Laureen has heard me say this time and again, whenever we talk about the work we do with WikiRate, like we have to collaborate. And so that's what we're trying to do, is just offer opportunities for concrete collaboration. We all talk about it so much and it happens so rarely. The OAR ID provides that unique ID that you can use to compare data sets. You can look on the website and be able to see who else is affiliated with a facility that I'm affiliated with, and initiate that collaboration. And then as we think about more and more data in this system, more and more users coming on board, and maybe not using Excel, but using more complex systems, that OAR ID facilitates interoperability and connects through the API. So super quickly, to make it practical, BHRRC is probably an organization that many of you are familiar with, and they use our data. One quick and easy example, they were able to help reinstate a majority of 1,000 garment workers who were striking over non-payment of benefits in Cambodia, and get them rehired. And what BHRRC did was they identified the brand sourcing from the factory, asked for their response and plan of action, and the majority of workers were reinstated. So I know we're going to talk about this more in the discussion, but we're really eager to collaborate with others. We're actually expanding beyond apparel to additional industries. So we'll be increasing the size of our database by quite a bit. We're excited to create change together. So I'm excited to chat more. Thanks.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Natalie. And let me just see if I can share these again. I hope that's working. So just to kind of recap some of the things we heard from Natalie, it's really, it's all about matching, right? Are we talking about the same facility here? Getting that opacity gone and really knowing what we are talking about, who are we talking about? And of course, when you are thinking about big brands, the big names, we kind of know that Coca-Cola is Coca-Cola. But when you talk about Apparel Manufacturing Ltd, it might be many different organizations that have that name depending on where they're based. And so you also get the duplication. A name is not enough. We need those unique identifiers to know if we're talking about the same facilities, same places and organizations, to really get that standardization and really enable that collaboration. And so that is also really what these technologies can help us do. So then we come to our final speaker. We have for you William Propler, who is a researcher with the Strategic Technologies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His work focuses on cybersecurity policy and the governance of emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, 5G telecommunications, and blockchain. William, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Laureen. I'm very, very pleased to be able to be here today. So yes, I think some of my discussion may complement being interesting addition to what some of Natalie presented on. So at CSIS, we've been conducting research into emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning for a number of years now. And we're actually just now finishing up a 2-year project looking into the human rights implications of facial recognition and blockchain technologies around the world. And I won't speak too much about the facial recognition portion of that because that was more focused on kind of the risks of that application, so not quite as relevant here. But a lot of our findings from the blockchain portion of this project have raised some interesting issues about the potential benefits, but also a lot of the challenges that organizations are facing trying to deploy emerging technologies like not just blockchain specifically, but also the AI and machine learning systems that we found are often kind of deployed in concert as a complement to a lot of those systems. So just as way of overview, blockchain, of course, is most famous for being the technology underlying Bitcoin and various cryptocurrencies, but it also has other uses in addition. For those who may not be as familiar, blockchain can essentially be thought of at a high level as a kind of distributed database where every member who exists on the network is able to have a full copy of the whole historical record of transactions on that network, where transactions are logged in a immutable, tamper-resistant way, and where governance of the network is distributed so that actors have to come together to agree and validate new transactions that are added instead of that power being held by a single centralized authority. So as I'm sure most of you in this room probably know, blockchain has been proposed as an almost magic wand-like solution to almost every problem that exists in the world today. And while I wish that were true, it's very clear to us that blockchain is not a panacea to any problem, but we have found that it may have some value as one tool that's a part of a larger suite of techniques and technologies that can be brought to bear against a lot of human rights pertinent challenges. And one of those is supply chain traceability. So the idea of using blockchain for supply chain traceability is that every item in a supply chain or every batch of items would be tagged, be that with a QR code, an RFID or NFC tag, or some other type of sensor. And that would be linked to a record that would be kept on the blockchain, kind of parallel record. And then as those items are bought and sold between firms, those tags could be scanned. The record on the blockchain would be updated, and eventually you would yield a kind of full and complete record of the item's journey through that supply chain and the identities of all the different actors that were kind of involved at every step along the way. This would obviously be a big benefit for companies that were looking to better map out their supply chains, understand more than a couple of layers deep what types of companies they were linked to, and better kind of prioritize due diligence procedures. And all of that sounds great in theory, but there are lots and lots of very big problems with implementing these, a lot of challenges. And I'll just touch very briefly on 3 of the main ones that we've kind of come across. One being, how do you get people to join this network? In order for these systems to work, you really need everyone from the very first initial producers to the last kind of downstream buyers to all be uploading information to the system, linking this information. If there are gaps, then that means you can no longer do those interlinkages. Your ability to actually map that supply chain has been seriously compromised. And there are a number of reasons why organizations may not want to join a system like this. They may have something to hide. They may be wary of sharing potentially sensitive business information like pricing, production volumes, business partnerships. They may simply just have a system that they already like and they don't want to transition to a new one. They don't want the headache. And all of these problems are particularly acute when you consider that it's not only important to get all of the different actors, all the different companies in a supply chain on the same page, but also the government regulators and the enforcement agencies that often have a really key role in collecting and reporting data about these companies. So getting everybody to be able to agree on common platforms is really challenging. And then in addition, getting everyone to agree, and this was touched on by previous panelists, on common data standards. What data is reported? What format is it reported in? There are so many different pieces of data that can be gathered about a particular item. How do you get a consortium to come together to say, these are the ones we're going to collect and we're going to report? That's a really big barrier to even just setting up the system initially and getting anything off the ground. And then finally, these systems come with a lot of complications due to the necessary technical infrastructure. We had a conversation with one group in Indonesia that was complaining that they were struggling to even get fisheries to record their catches on paper, let alone on a system that would require a smartphone, consistent connection to the internet, as well as a bunch of sensors for which the local capacity for installing and maintaining them just didn't exist. So a lot of these systems were maybe like a couple of steps ahead of what's actually necessary, particularly for a lot of the small scale and artisanal producers that kind of you most need to be able to bring into that supply chain. And then, of course, even if you solve all of those problems, there's still a huge gap, because even if you were able to just know all of the different companies that you were linked to, that information alone isn't useful unless you also have some ability to be able to get reliable information about the conditions of production, about what's actually going on the ground in a lot of these suppliers. Are they breaking any laws? Are they engaging in abusive labor practices? And this is a place where blockchain as a technology just falls down completely. It's a good platform potentially for logging information, but that's kind of it. It's a database wearing a fancy hat. It doesn't give you kind of magical goggles that lets you see into the business processes of the company. And so this is actually where we found that artificial intelligence and machine learning tools may have some value as a way to be able to parse operational data that's being produced by some of these firms in a way that can lead to insight, that can lead to flags that may be useful, that can be linked maybe on a blockchain and allow downstream buyers to be able to better see whenever any of these problems were emerging. But ultimately, it was something that kind of would rely on a totally different suite of technologies. So one example that we thought was interesting was in the seafood industry. There are a few organizations that are doing very interesting work using satellite imagery and using the radio signals given off by vessel monitoring systems in order to kind of track fishing vessels in the sea and be able to crunch that data on large scales to create flags for, if a ship was out at sea for 12 months, 24 months. If it was frequently meeting with other ships or other ports that had been flagged for being at high risk of human trafficking, or if they were fishing in unauthorized waters. Some of these issues, it's something that you would be able to automatically crunch that data thanks to machine learning, be able to do it at scale, and be able to arrive at flags that would allow a broad range of kind of deeper auditing to take place and would allow you to focus that a little bit better. So there's value here, but I also want to emphasize there were also a lot of challenges too. So bringing up two of the main ones. One is data availability. So the data that you would want in order to crunch and determine a lot of these flags may simply not be available to you. So the satellite imagery and the vessel monitoring systems are kind of an exception. In a lot of cases, the data that you want is going to be held by the companies themselves, or potentially by the government regulators and the enforcement agencies. So this could be something like worker pay, labor turnover rates, missing legal documentation, reports of abuse by workers. All of this is information that could potentially be compiled at scale and can be run through a system that could be trained to identify patterns that may be able to point towards risk. But it's going to take a lot of work engaging with regulators who have this data and downstream buyers requiring some of this data to be turned over by their upstream producers before some of it may become available for other groups to be able to kind of play with. Oh, yes, and I see in the chat that the transparency benefits of blockchain are very much dependent on exactly how it is architected. It can be something that is incredibly private and only available to a couple of companies. It can be something that is very public and available to anyone. There's a huge spectrum, so you can never assume that the blockchain will provide the kind of transparency that Bitcoin advocates say just because you use the word. So it's a very, very tricky technology there. And then the last kind of complication is that there are obviously ways of gaming the system. So for instance, we heard of one plan to use to have workers upload their contracts and attest that they were correct. And then you would be able to use machine learning to look at them at scale to see whether or not there were any provisions that may be risky or any omissions that may be risky. But of course, there's no guarantee that those contracts are actually being honored in the field. So there's always this gap, and we encountered similar similar kind of cases with worker pay. There were lots of ways that you could try and architect a system to increase visibility, but there were lots of ways for employers to be able to exploit it. So, I mean, these systems can be valuable for raising flags, but I guess overall conclusion is that you have to be very, very aware of what the gaps are and what the problems may be. And I think I'll stop there. I may be going over.
Thank you so much, William. That was great. And yeah, just to reiterate a few things there, we're looking at both the availability of the data, but also the accessibility of that data, right? Are we able to get what we need? Often technology is talked about as a silver bullet that is going to give you all the answers to your questions. But if the data to answer your questions isn't there, how is that technology going to get you those answers? So really think through, are the building blocks that you need to kind of input into that technology to get the outputs that you're looking for, are those there? And also, if they're not there, maybe your technology can first be that first step in helping you talk to those that can help you get the building blocks. So get the buy-in from stakeholders on the ground. Why is it so important that they are making certain records and that they are providing access to those records? What are, get that buy-in and have them see the value also for them, not just for others further away from them. So and also, again, what is that? What are the challenges there for the smaller businesses and the smaller stakeholders? Do they have the capacity and the resources and the technologies that they might need to partake in that system? So kind of, I don't want to go on too much because you've heard already enough from me, but I wanted to open up for the last few minutes to see if there's any questions that we would like to discuss with the group. I know we're not that many at the moment, so if I can see if there's any in the chat. I don't think I've seen any questions come through just yet. Are there any? For the other participants, you are very welcome to unmute yourself and just kind of ask your questions as we go.
I had one comment about the blockchain and AI systems. So one of the things that's happening is that nation states are beginning to stand up blockchain AI systems that they intend to be used not only for finance, but medical data, for all sorts of data. So for instance, China certainly has one, and that also supports their central bank digital currency. Singapore has one called Project Ubin, which is intended to be for the Indo-Pacific area. It's not just for Singapore. And it was developed by their sovereign wealth fund, which has serious ownership of most of the banks and telcos in the Indo-Pacific. That's worth paying attention to. And we helped the government of Switzerland set up one through the offices of Swiss Post and Swisscom. And so the idea there is to have a convenient national system for moving data around in an accountable way that is available both through post office facilities and telco facilities. Right? And so I think you're going to see a lot more of those, which will really change the outlook for a lot of these, because instead of being bespoke things done by small organizations, there'll be facilities like the internet. I mean, the internet used to be this way too, right? There was more than one standard and it was crazy, but it was, and eventually, and then the web was another version of this, where suddenly this hard to use thing called the internet got very standardized and exploded. So I would expect to see that in our near future.
Yeah, and Alex, if I may, I know because the blockchain is also really looking at, the sharing of control, if you will, or over some of this data. And I know one of the projects that you are also involved in is this open algorithms project, which has certainly caught our attention at WikiRate, because we really like the idea of shifting the control. When we share data, often we share the control of that data as well. And so leaving the data in the place where it is and leaving the control with the original holder of that data, but being able to access the information that is shareable is something that we were really interested in. Is there maybe something more that you could add on that?
Well, yeah, a general principle which people are finally sort of clinging to. I mean, large organizations and governments is you don't make copies of data, period. What you do is you ask questions and get answers in a auditable fashion. And what that does is that lets you keep track of when things are going awry in various ways. It also means that there's only one real copy of the data, which is the place where the individual who volunteered the data or gave the data intended it to be. So you can know where your data is, and now you can know what's being done with it. And those are sort of the core to this idea that you have to have ownership rights over data, which is the sort of core idea within GDPR and the California law and so forth.
Yeah, which is a really interesting principle when you think about data coming from these less powerful stakeholders, right? So in the supply chain, when you get data from workers or from facilities that are worried about what that data might be used for, getting them engaged with this kind of layer of protection is really something that might help you move the needle on that front. So I know we're at time, so I would like to, if there's no final comments from the speakers, I would hand it over back to Jackie for a closing remark.